Breaking overnight, Russia launched a barrage of cruise, ballistic, and hypersonic missiles across Ukraine. At least 2 people were killed, more than a dozen wounded in the past 24 hours. This comes as Ukrainian drones caused havoc at airports in Moscow, grounding flights and causing long delays. The timing of Russia's strikes is complicated, though, as less than 24 hours ago, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told Russian state media that Russia is ready to move quickly on achieving a peace deal with Ukraine, but he reiterated that the main goal was to achieve Russia's, quote, objectives. Joining me now is CNN senior military analyst, retired Admiral James Stavridis. He is also the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and is partner of the Carlyle Group. Appreciate you being here. Let's start with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He's calling for talks with Russia next week to push forward ceasefire talks. We're also, though, hearing from the Kremlin spokesperson this morning who says Russia has a draft memorandum, Ukraine has a draft memorandum, and right now they are completely diametrically opposed. So still a lot of work to get done. Where do you start to try and make inroads here?
Russia simply continues to play rope-a-dope with the world. And it's a stack of lies that goes back 3 years, Omar, when we heard from Peskov and the entire Russian leadership, to include Putin, that, oh no, we're not going to invade Ukraine. We're simply holding maneuvers on their borders. Shortly thereafter, the invasion occurred. And here we are today, as you correctly point out, in essentially a military stalemate, attacks on both capitals, rising drone warfare. So what happens next? We have to think of this really as a triangle at this point, not a static Russia, Ukraine. The third point, of course, is the United States of America. Here I give credit to the Trump administration for realizing that Putin is no friend to the United States. He is simply playing us along, and therefore what we ought to do at this point, and the president announced a lead time of 50 days on this, is put additional economic pressure on Russia, continue providing weapons to Ukraine, confiscate Russian monies in the hands of the West. Those are the pressure points. If we use those, we can push Putin to the table.
And, you know, some glimpses, or the few glimpses of diplomacy, I will say to this point, is we have seen some prisoner exchanges back and forth between Russia and Ukraine to this point. But the last round of ceasefire talks ended pretty quickly. And the reporting from Russian state media is that Russia put forward maximalist territorial demands as part of their preconditions for a ceasefire, while Ukraine has previously refused to consider any territorial concessions in exchange for peace. What is the role of NATO and the United States? I know you touched on the United States a little bit there, but what is the role of NATO and the U.S. in brokering a ceasefire or peace deal?
NATO has an extremely important role. My successor as Supreme Allied Commander wakes up every morning thinking, how do I get more weapons into the hands of the Ukrainians? These weapons are largely being manufactured and purchased from U.S. defense entities. They're flowing through NATO and our European allies. They're going into the hands of the Ukrainians. These, alongside the fighting spirit of the Ukrainians, are the reasons that Putin has not been able to conquer the entire country. Back to the diplomatic side, Omar, my sense of it is that the Ukrainians are willing to come to the table, have a conversation about where a territorial line should be drawn. Russia is the problem. They continue to demand simply the conquering of Ukraine. We cannot permit that to happen.
And before we go, President Trump, as we talked about a little bit here, had offered that 50-day window. But we heard from the Russians that 50 days, it used to be 24 hours, it used to be 100 days. We've been through all of this. And so what options does the president have? Because, look, Russia is no stranger to sanctions and economic pressures.
The big two that still are unemployed, we haven't used them, are number one, secondary sanctions, Omar. That's moving beyond simply sanctioning Russia and Russian entities and sanctioning those who do business with Russia, notably China and India. Would like to avoid that, but I think that's a very big tool. There's a bill in the Senate to do that. And then secondly, we don't talk about it a lot. We have options in the world of cyber, which could help put some more additional pressures on Russia. And I'll give you a third and final one. Russia has 300 billion, perhaps a bit more than that, of their money in Western banks. That could be confiscated and provided to the Ukrainians for reconstruction. There's three big tools we haven't used yet that we ought to think about.
And those assets still frozen at this point, but as you point out, could be permanently confiscated.
Exactly.
Admiral James Stavridis, really appreciate the time. Thank you.